During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length I found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of the melancholy House of Usher. I looked upon the scene, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, and upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium. I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant eye-like windows. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country, a letter from him. The writer spoke of an acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me as his best, and indeed his only personal friend, with the view of attempting, by the cheerfulness of my society, some alleviation of his malady. Yet I really knew very little of my friend. His reserve had always been excessive and habitual. I had learned, too, the very remarkable fact that the stem of the Usher race, all time-honored as it was, had put forth at no period any enduring branch. It was this deficiency, perhaps, of collateral issue, and the consequent undeviating transmission from sire to son of the patrimony with the name which had at length so identified the two as to merge the original title of the estate in the quaint and equivocal appellation of the House of Usher, an appellation which seemed to include, in the minds of the peasantry who used it, both the family and the family mansion. When I uplifted my eyes again to the house, from its image in the pool, there grew in my mind a strange fancy. I had so worked upon my imagination as really to believe that about the whole mansion and domain there hung an atmosphere peculiar to themselves and their immediate vicinity, an atmosphere which had no affinity with the air of heaven, but which had reeked up from the decayed trees and the gray wall and the silent tarn, a pestilent and mystic vapor. Noticing these things, I rode over a short causeway to the house. A servant in waiting took my horse, and I entered the Gothic archway in the hall. Much that I encountered on the way contributed, I know not how, to heighten the vague sentiments of which I have already spoken. The room in which I found myself was large and lofty. Dark draperies hung upon the walls. The general furniture was profuse, comfortless, antique, and tattered. Many books and musical instruments lay scattered about, but failed to give any vitality to the scene. Upon my entrance, Usher arose from the sofa in which he had been lying at full length and greeted me with a vivacious warmth which had much in it. I at first thought of an overdone cordiality. A glance, however, at his countenance convinced me of his perfect sincerity. We sat down. Surely man had never before been so terribly altered in so brief a period as had Roderick Usher. The now ghastly pallor of the skin and the now miraculous luster of the eye above all things startled and even awed me. In the manner of my friend, I was at once struck with an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon found this to arise from a series of feeble and futile struggles to overcome a habitual trepidancy, an excessive nervous agitation. He spoke of the object of my visit, of his earnest desire to see me, and of the solace he expected me to afford him. he entered at some length into what he conceived to be the nature of his malady. It was, he said, constitutional and a family evil, and for one which he despaired to find a remedy. To an anomalous species of terror, I found him bound in a slave.
I shall perish. I must perish in this despicable folly. I shudder at the thought of any, even the most trivial incident which may operate upon this intolerable agitation of soul. I feel that the period will sooner or later arrive when I must abandon life and reason together in some struggle with this grim phantasm, with this fear.
I learned, moreover, he was enchained by certain superstitious impressions in regard to the dwelling he tenanted, and whence for many years he had never ventured forth. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the peculiar gloom which thus afflicted him could be traced to a more natural and far more palpable origin, to the severe and long-continued illness, indeed to the evidently approaching dissolution of a tenderly beloved sister, his sole companion for long years, his last and only relative on earth. Her decease would leave him the last of the ancient race of the Ushers. While he spoke, the Lady Madeline, for so she was called, passed slowly through a remote portion of the apartment, and without having noticed my presence, disappeared. I regarded her with an astonishment not unmingled with dread. The disease of the Lady Madeline had long baffled the skill of her physicians. A settled apathy, a gradual wasting away of the person, and frequent, although transient, affections of a partially cataleptical character were the unusual diagnosis. Hitherto, she had steadily borne up against the pressure of her malady and had not betaken herself finally to bed. But on the closing in of the evening of my arrival, she succumbed, as her brother told me, to the prostrating power of the destroyer. And I learned that the glimpse I had obtained of her person would thus probably be the last I should obtain, that the lady, at least while living, would be seen by me no more. I shall ever bear about me a memory of the many solemn hours I thus spent alone with the master of the House of Usher. Yet I should fail in any attempt to convey an idea of the exact character of the studies. His long, improvised dirges will ring forever in my ears. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar, which gave birth in great measure to the fantastic character of his performances. I fancied that I perceived, and for the first time, a full consciousness on the part of Usher of the tottering of his lofty reason upon her throne. One evening, having informed me abruptly that the Lady Madeline was no more, he stated his intention of preserving her corpse for a fortnight in one of the numerous vaults within the main walls of the building. At the request of Usher, I personally aided him in the arrangements for the temporary entombment. The body having been in coffin, we two alone bore it to its rest. The vault in which we placed it, and which had been so long unopened that our torches, half smothered in its oppressive atmosphere, gave us little opportunity for investigation. It was small, damp, and entirely without means or admission of light. And it lied at great depth immediately beneath that portion of the building in which was my own sleeping apartment. Having deposited our mournful burden upon trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between the brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some words from which I learned the deceased and himself had been twins, and and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease, which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth, had left, as usual, in all maladies of a strictly cataleptical character, the mockery of a faint blush upon her bosom and face, and the suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip, which is so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and having secured the door of iron, we made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house. And now, some days of bitter grief having elapsed, an observable change came over the features of the mental disorder of my friend. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. At times, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicable vagaries of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me by slow yet certain degrees the wild influences of his fantastic yet impressive superstitions. It was especially upon retiring to bed in the late night of the 7th or 8th day after the placing of the Lady Madeline within the dungeon that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch, while the hours waned and waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominion over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all, of what I felt was due to the bewildering influence of the gloomy furniture of the room, of the dark and tattered draperies which tortured into motion by the breath of a rising tempest. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened. I know not why, except that an instinctive spirit prompted me to certain low, indefinite sounds which came through the pauses of the storm at long intervals, I know not whence. Overpowered by an intense sentiment of horror, I threw on my clothes with haste. A light step on the adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. His countenance was, as usual, cadaverously wan, but moreover there was a species of mad hilarity in his eyes. His air appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude which I so long endured.
And you have not seen it? You have not seen it? But say, you shall.
Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements and threw it freely open to the storm. The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. We had no glimpse of the moon or the stars, nor was there any flashing forth of lightning, but the undersurfaces of the huge masses of the agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light which hung about and enshrouded the mansion. You must not, you shall not behold this, I said shudderingly to Usher. These appearances which bewilder you are merely electrical phenomena, not uncommon. Let us close this casement. Here is one of your favorite romances. I will read, and you shall listen, and so we shall pass away this terrible night together. The antique volume which I had taken up was The Mad Tryst of Sir Lancelot Canning. I indulged a vague hope that the excitement which now agitated the hypochondriac might find relief. I arrived at that well-known portion of the story where Ethelred, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good an entrance by force. From some very remote portion of the mansion, there came indistinctly to my ears what might have been, in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Lancelot had so particularly described. It was beyond doubt the coincidence alone which had arrested my attention. I continue the story. Who slayeth the dragon, the shield he shall win. And Ethelred uplifted his mace and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave up his pesty breath with a shriek so horrid and harsh and withal so piercing that Ethelred had feigned to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it. The like thereof was never before heard. Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could be no doubt whatever that in this instance I did actually hear. Although from what direction it proceeded, I found it impossible to say. A low, apparently distant, but harsh, protracted, and most unusual, grating sound. I resumed the narrative of Sir Lancelot, which thus proceeded. And now, the champion, having escaped from the terrible fury of the dragon, removed the carcass from out of the way before him, and approached valorously over the silver pavement of the castle to where the shield was upon the wall, which in sooth tarried, not for his full coming, but fell down at his feet upon the silver floor. No sooner had these syllables passed my lips than, as if a shield of brass had indeed at the moment fallen heavily upon a floor of silver. Completely unnerved, I leaped to my feet. The measured rocking and movement of Usher was undisturbed. I rushed to the chair in which he sat. I placed my hand upon his shoulder, and there came a strong shudder over his whole person. A sickly smile quivered about his lips.
Not hear it. Yes, I hear it, and have heard it. Long, many minutes, many hours, many days have I heard it. We have put her living in the tomb. I heard her first feeble movements in this hollow coffin. I heard them, yet I dared not speak. And now, tonight, Lancelot, Ethelred, the breaking of the hermit's door, the death cry of the dragon, and the clangor of the shield. Say, rather, these are the rending of her coffin, the grating of the iron hinges of her prison, her struggles within the coppered archway of the vault. Do I not distinguish that heavy and horrible beating of her heart? Madman! I tell you that she now stands without the door.
The huge antique panels to which the speaker pointed threw slowly back. There did stand the lofty and enshrouded figure of the Lady Madeline of Usher, blood upon her white robes. For a moment, she remained, trembling and reeling. Then, with a low moaning cry, she fell heavily inward upon the person of her brother, and in her violent and now final death agonies, she bore him to the floor a corpse, and a victim to the terrors that he had anticipated. From that chamber and from that mansion, I fled aghast. The storm was still abroad in all its wrath as I found myself crossing the causeway. Suddenly there shot along the path a wild light, and I turned to see whence a gleam so unusual could have issued, for the vast house and its shadows were alone behind me. The radiance was that of the full and setting, blood-red moon. There came a fierce breath of the whirlwind. The entire orb of the satellite burst at once upon my sight. My brain reeled as I saw the mighty walls rushing asunder. There was a long, tumultuous shouting sound like the voice of 1,000 white waters, and the deep and the dank tarn at my feet closed sullenly and silently over the fragments of the House of Usher.